Goes without saying that 2020 has been a lot for a lot of people on a lot of levels. We've had spikes in anxiety, in depression, in addiction, and certainly heading into an incredibly tense and fraught election next week as well. So I wanted to speak with someone. We talk about politics all the time, but I wanted to talk to someone on a little bit of a higher level of how to make sense of this time that we're living through. So I have the perfect person here, best-selling author and former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, who also, by the way, has a new podcast. Tell us about that, Marianne. Great to see you.
Well, thank you so much. It's always good to see you, Crystal. Yeah, the Marianne Williamson podcast drops today. My first guest is Carolyn Mace, author Carolyn Mace. And then I have a podcast coming up with Stephen Donziger. You've probably covered his case with Chevron, and Anand Girdidas, and a lot of wonderful, wonderful guests. So thank you for mentioning it.
Looking forward to that very much. So we talked to you about politics, and I always value your insights and opinions there, but just feel like this year has been so much for people to process, and they feel like things are kind of spiraling out of control. How are you making sense of that and fitting that into your worldview?
Well, a spiritual worldview, spirituality is the path of the heart. And in terms of how we deal with what's happening now, there are three elements of the spiritual path that I think apply. Number one is the comfort that it gives us at times of difficulty. Number two, the guidance it gives us in terms of right action as well as right thinking. And the third has to do with how to repair that which has been broken. In terms of how we make it through difficult times, you know, the spiritual path is the mystical core of all the great religious teachings. So in Christianity, for instance, the idea here is that the crucifixion is followed by the resurrection. It takes that symbolic 3 days, but it will happen. In the Jewish religion, the Old Testament, the idea is that first, yes, there is there's slavery. Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, but they do make it to the Promised Land within that symbolic 40 years. So what the spiritual path tells us is this will get better. Evil does exist. Chaos does exist. Darkness does exist. The invalidation of the heart does exist. However, love will ultimately prevail. And when this is spoken of in secular terms, this is why that we often hear the quote that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So the spiritual path helps us at a time like this to stand on the knowledge that this too shall pass. But that alone is not enough. The spiritual path makes us question, why did this happen? The spiritual path is one in which we take full responsibility. And the spiritual path being the path of the heart, what we are being faced with as a nation, what confronts us is the deep question, how did America so go off the rails that hatred was able to get this much primacy to begin with? Where did we go wrong that hatred and chaos and mean-spiritedness and violence ever got this much of a foothold in our society? And there's a lot to look at there. You know, when you look at the white supremacists and you look at the groups, the hate-filled groups, these are not, for the most part, people who had the kind of educational opportunities that should, I believe, be universally available. They are not, for the most part, people who had access to the kind of economic opportunities that many of us feel should be fully available. And the other issue is the issue of deep atonement, you know, whether it's the Catholics going to confession or the Jews on the day of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, or in AA, which is a spiritual program, people having to acknowledge the exact nature of their character defects, to admit their wrongs. The United States has to look in the mirror now. That is the spiritual path. There is no spiritual path without brutal self-awareness and honesty. And that's what I think people are trying to do right now, to recognize the legacies of slavery, to recognize the legacies among Native Americans of genocide, to recognize the legacies of misogyny, to recognize the presence of anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc. So the spiritual path is not just a path of the heart, it is the path of the deep inquiry into where the heart has been wounded and how to repair it. And that applies as much to a nation as it applies to an individual.
And I think this is one of the things that is both beautiful and promising and also troubling to me about what you're saying here, because you're basically, I'm radically simplifying what you're saying, but the path is love, right? The path forward is love and to come back together as a country, as hokey as that sounds. And yet there's so much hatred, not just at, the people who have put us in this place or structures or systems. There's been such media-driven hatred at one another and our fellow citizens and judgment, and a sense that our friends or our neighbors or former friends and neighbors or aunts and uncles, etc., are the real existential threats to our lives and our livelihoods. How do you think about that? How do you think about overcoming that?
I'm sure that you know Matt Taibbi and his book, Hate Incorporated. What journalism has become too often in the United States, and programs like yours are the antidote, is that we have moved from a public service mentality to a marketing mentality. As soon as the Telecommunications Act of 1996 allowed this corporatization, corporate conglomeratization of the media, too much of the mainstream media, became more about getting the click, making the sale, than about the public service of providing the truth. And the truth of the matter is, the marketing truth is that you're going to make more of a sale if you create more drama. And so making it about the fight, making it about the cat fight, making people hate each other actually has benefited the economic bottom line, the short-term profit of these huge media conglomerates. And that's why people mistrust the media. And you see this too much on the left as well as on the right.
Marianne, the other thing I wanted to ask you is, in 2020, I'm not a particularly religious, or really I would describe myself as that much of a spiritual person, but there's just this sense that things are off the rails. Like, when I covered the news at MSNBC, we would have days where it was like, what are we really going to cover today? There's nothing that's like really grabbing us for that first block of the show, so we kind of make something up and kind of gin it up like it was more important than we really thought that it was. And now you have unprecedented event after unprecedented event, massive pandemic, massive economic pain, massive addiction crisis, the largest protest movement in the nation's history, just coming at you one after another after another. How do you make sense of that? Are there periods of time in the past that you've studied that has some relevance to? How do you think about that accelerating pace of insanely, black swan events just coming one after another after another?
Well, from a spiritual perspective, in the East, they call it karma. And in the West, it's called cause and effect. In a very real way, what's surprising is that things didn't get off the rail sooner. And let's be very clear. Things have been off the rail for millions and millions of people in the United States based on bad public policy. And things have been off the rail for millions and millions of people around the world due to American foreign policy. So really what we're saying is things are off the rail for us. Things are off the rails for us. This was inevitable. We have developed over the last 40 years particularly, and I'm not saying things were perfect before, Crystal, but at least there was a social consensus that we were supposed to try to be a good country. We were supposed to try at least to have public policy that expressed the better angels of our nature. Not that anybody thought we ever fully embodied it or manifested it, but there was a sense among us on both left and right that really we were supposed to try. We gave that up about 40 years ago, and we never stopped. We moved into an ethos, a soulless ethos, with no sense of ethical or moral consideration for Earth or its inhabitants. And we made a short-term bottom line for huge corporate entities, not only the bottom line within capitalism, so that there was an unfettered, virulent strain of capitalism that began to dominate. But with all the money in politics, particularly that corporate money, the government itself became handmaiden to that soulless economic system, as opposed to handmaiden to the health and the well-being of the American people, the earth on which we live, and the people of the world. So anybody who's like, oh my goodness, where did this come from, has not been looking deeply and has not been applying the moral and spiritual principles that I'm speaking of, which also, you don't have to see this stuff like take yourself. I mean, I'm not pandering to you. I think of you as a moral force in this country. You're a moral force because you speak the truth, and you do speak of ethics, and you do speak of conscience, and you do demand brutal honesty and self-awareness on the part of this country. that whether you see these things within a context of religion or spirituality doesn't matter. What matters is conscience and goodness, and who are we as people that we are behaving that way. I knew that a catastrophe was coming. I've been writing about a catastrophe coming for about 20 years. I don't think anybody thought it was going to happen this swiftly and this hard, because I don't think any of us thought one man could do this much damage in 3 years. But it's here. And this is not the moment to keep moving the way we've been moving. This is a moment to look in the mirror and to repair what has been broken.
So, Marianne, election on Tuesday. Polls say Joe Biden has a good shot at it. Not that anyone wants to take anything for granted. What do you think the path forward looks like if Joe Biden is elected? What do you think the path forward looks like if Donald Trump is reelected?
I think I can assume that for you, for me, and for millions of us, we're going to be doing the same work no matter who wins. I certainly hope that Joe Biden wins, because we need him to break the free fall of American democracy and to get the fascists out of the White House. But that doesn't mean the work is over. And no one with a deep, and certainly you, Crystal, are a main articulator of that understanding. We are going to have to course correct this nation away from a fascist or authoritarian trajectory, but also away from the neoliberal trajectory that paved the way for the authoritarian in the White House. So I think people like you and I are going to be doing the same work no matter who wins. But I, of course, hope that it will be Joe Biden.
I think that's very well said. Marianne, thank you so much. It's so great to have you today.
Thank you so much for everything, Crystal. God bless.
My pleasure. And we'll have more Rising for you after this.